GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, and for our fourth segment of the day, we're transitioning from talking about a head coach firing to an offensive coordinator firing, digging a little bit close to home, going up to the PNW to talk about the firing of offensive coordinator Ryan Grubb after just one season in Seattle. Now remember, Ryan Grubb was someone who was the offensive coordinator at the University of Washington, led one of the most prolific scoring offenses in college football history over there, led them to the national championship game, and coming into this season, after being hired as the Seattle Seahawks offensive coordinator to round out Mike Macdonald's staff, it was a lot of hope, a lot of optimism as to what the Seattle Seahawks offense could look like. Obviously, it meant a lot of responsibility from Geno Smith, as seemingly it opened up the pass game to new horizons, but it also meant that potentially there was going to be a lot more ambition in the decision-making of the offensive coordinator in Seattle, because as a Seattle Seahawks fan, I can tell you there has been a lot of frustration with the offensive coordinator position and how it has been handled. And I feel like a lot of it does stem from organizational, quote-unquote, dysfunction, not necessarily dysfunction to the point of nothing's working, but dysfunction in terms of how this personnel / structure is set up over here in Seattle, because I do feel like a lot of fans do think that a passing attack could work because we have the receivers to do it, but also they do want to see more balance, more complementary football from the Seattle offense, because at this current moment, we can't necessarily employ that, but also it's on the offensive coordinator to at least try and develop that into your offensive system. And I feel that's why they parted ways with him after just one season up there in Seattle. They did go 10-7, and despite some inconsistencies in their offense, there were moments where the Seattle offense felt like it could score with anybody. There were really a lot of bright spots, but there were a lot of low spots as well, namely the failures of the offensive line, failing to find a starting combination up front that really coalesced well together, the running game, which we'll talk about a lot in this segment, and also the red zone offense, especially Geno Smith. But I feel like, as well, they kind of bit the bullet a little bit too soon. And the reason I'm saying that is, when you look at Seattle's offense, you have a lot of nice pieces. You have perhaps one of the top 5 receiving cores in the NFL. You seemingly have a running game that could be an established, potent running attack. And you have a quarterback in Geno Smith that has proven that he's at least competent enough to get you to a 10-7 point, get you within the playoff picture, which is what you want as you're a new head coach, as you're trying to improve year in, year out in this tenure. And so I kind of feel like giving up on Ryan Grubb feels a little bit too soon. And I feel like they should have at least allowed him one season to, should Seattle have gone into this offseason with a concrete plan and really hit all the marks with that plan, to then implement his style of offense with a new rebuilt, revamped offense. But unfortunately, that's not the way of the NFL. I don't necessarily feel that his philosophies certainly align with Mike Macdonald's philosophies, and that's why ultimately I'm kind of on the fence about this firing. But let's talk about the mishaps of this offense this season before we talk into why potentially Ryan Grubb could have stayed. They were 21st in scoring, 14th in total scoring, 8th in pass yards. So on the surface, a pretty average offense by NFL standards. And in a league where passing seemingly has gone down, their elevation in terms of passing, their evolutionary style of passing the football, seemingly worked for them enough. But here's the moral of the story here. In Seattle, no matter who's the head coach, they're going to want to run the football, because in Seattle, defense matters a little bit more than what you do on offense. And if you don't run the ball, then your defense isn't commented well enough. And so that's what frustrates a lot of Seattle fans and a lot within the organization. When you can't run the football, you can't play your brand of football as a result. They were only 28th in rushing, 17th in yards per carry, and that's not going to cut it in that Seattle environment. And so that's where I feel Ryan Grubb failed to capture the essence of what a Seattle offense needs to be. He didn't really stick with the run game in certain situations, and as a result, his red zone offense stagnated. Geno Smith was asked to pass the football a little bit too much, and as a result, this offensive line cratered around him when it was already bad to begin with. And so that's why I feel Ryan Grubb missed the mark here. But then again, when you look at all the deficiencies, are they entirely Ryan Grubb's fault? Geno Smith is forced to throw the football in that area because, well, your run blocking on your offensive line is atrocious, and you can't run the football in those 20-yard patches of the field. And if you can't run the football, the only way to attack defense is trying to vary your passing game, which ultimately worked more often than not in Seattle. I actually think Ryan Grubb, in a sense, overachieved with what he had, because there's no way this offense passing the football should have worked as much as it did, to the point where they were one spot away from making the playoffs in spite of that offensive line. But I do feel like there's a standard in Seattle to where if one aspect of the offense isn't clicking along with the other, then you're gone. And it has been the case these past couple of years. Guys like Waldron, guys like Schottenheimer, who have failed to adapt when teams have tried to take away the passing game. And this season, I kind of felt the reverse, because a lot of teams knew that Seattle was going to be a very pass-heavy team after a certain point in time, and ultimately keyed in the run game. And the passing attack actually became better in certain moments. But it was key moments in the red zone that ultimately did Seattle in. And ultimately, had they had a decent run game, who knows what this offense would have been, and ultimately where they would have been in the terms of the playoff picture. They could have won the NFC West, maybe even as a 3-2 seed, had a couple games swung their way, and ultimately had a shot in the playoff picture. But because of the ineptitudes of that running game, because of the ineptitudes of that offensive line, which in terms of Ryan Grubb aren't necessarily his fault, but something you feel he would have had to address, that's where frustration started to arise, and ultimately how Seattle came to this decision. And I feel like when we look at Mike Macdonald's first season, there was a clear vision here. I feel like he diagnosed problems in the defense. They were aggressive at the trade deadline, something that they haven't been in recent years. They signed Ernest Jones, who revamped this team. Hopefully they re-sign him yet again, and he doesn't end up in free agency, because he's a key catalyst to their defensive turnaround after the bye. And ultimately, Mike Macdonald had a stronger season if you look at what he did with the defense than Ryan Grubb with the offense, because the offense clearly put the defense in a hole because, well, they didn't retain the ball that long, and ultimately the offensive line wasn't figured out. While Mike Macdonald succeeded, Ryan Grubb ultimately failed, even though there were certain aspects of the offense that worked. And so I feel like Mike Macdonald is going to want to hire someone pragmatic, but I ultimately feel that if you're looking at all the offensive coordinators who could be available and could be willing to come to Seattle, they all might want to implement a more pass-heavy attack. I feel like, a lot of these young offensive coordinators who might be available for head coaching spots might not want to come to Seattle, potentially because of the fact that Mike Macdonald might want more of a run-heavy approach. But if you want to be a little bit more ambitious and go with someone who can ultimately offer a more conservative approach but has worked in an environment where a revitalized quarterback can provide a spark for you, look at Liam Cohen. I love what Liam Cohen has been able to do in Tampa with Baker Mayfield, rejuvenating his career. And I feel if he comes to Seattle and they stick with Geno, which it seemingly looks like they're going to do, I feel like Liam Cohen can adjust to whatever Mike Macdonald demands out of this offense. And I feel like he is someone who has also had to work with a kind of tenuous offensive line, a lot better than Seattle, but one that has been a little bit tenuous and does rely a little bit more on Baker's creation of structure. So I do feel he'll have some understanding of how to develop this offensive line. And I feel like he's also someone who's seen what opponent running attack can do with Bucky Irving, Rashad White, and Sean Tucker this year. So I do feel that Liam Cohen, if he's willing to accept another offensive coordinator job rather than try his trade at the head coaching position, could step into the role of Seattle offensive coordinator very nicely and really relate to someone like Geno in this offense, a guy who rejuvenated his career. So that could be another option, but I'm really not sure where Seattle's looking to go here in their search, because I feel like they could just want to get someone who implements their style, or they could be more ambitious. Who knows? But hopefully they finally get this one right, and ultimately we'll see a nice little offensive resurgence next year and hopefully see them in the playoff. Let me know what you think about this one in the comments. I just wanted to throw this in there as a Seattle Seahawks fan, as kind of my own segment to open my new chapter here of the show. But coming up next, we're going to be transitioning from American football to European football, and an unexpected top-of-the-table clash in the Premier League sees Nottingham Forest take on the slot machine that is Liverpool. We'll be right back to conclude today's show after this short break.